Welcome. Today I am going to tell you a story that will completely change the way you see art, history, and power. You might have heard about the Louvre before. Maybe you know it as the museum where the Mona Lisa hangs, or perhaps you've seen pictures of that famous glass pyramid in Paris. But today, I am going to tell you the real story. The story that will make you understand why this one building has been at the center of Western civilization for over 800 years. The Louvre is not just a museum, it is a medieval fortress that became a royal palace, then witnessed a revolution that changed the world, and finally transformed into the greatest treasure house of human civilization. It is a building that has housed kings and emperors, survived wars and revolutions, and now protects over 380,000 works of art, spanning 9,000 years of human history. It is the most visited museum on Earth. Over 10 million people walk through its doors every single year. This is the story of how a dark fortress built to defend against Viking invasions became a palace of unimaginable luxury. This is the story of kings who collected masterpieces, revolutionaries who declared art should belong to the people, and an emperor who stole half of Europe's treasures. This is the story of the Mona Lisa, the Venus de Milo, and the Winged Victory, and how they all ended up in one place. After listening to this, you will understand why the Louvre is not just a museum, it is a monument to human creativity, ambition, and our eternal need to preserve beauty for future generations. And this is not just a history lesson, this is a perfect story for your English listening practice. So sit back, relax, and let me take you on a journey through 8 centuries, a journey of power, beauty, theft, and redemption. Now, let's begin. The fortress in the mud. To understand the Louvre, we must go back in time to the year 1190 AD. Imagine medieval Paris, a crowded, filthy city of narrow streets and wooden houses clustered around the Île de la Cité, an island in the Seine River. This was not the Paris of elegant boulevards and cafes. This was a city that lived in constant fear of invasion. Viking raiders had terrorized France for over a century, sailing up the Seine River in their longships, burning, looting, and killing. King Philip II, known as Philip Augustus, was preparing to leave France to join the Third Crusade. He would be gone for years, fighting alongside Richard the Lionheart to reclaim Jerusalem from Saladin. But Philip was worried. Paris was vulnerable. The western edge of the city had no protection, just open fields leading down to the river. If enemies attacked while he was gone, Paris would fall. So Philip made a decision that would change history. He ordered the construction of a massive fortress on the western edge of Paris, right on the banks of the Seine. It would be called the Louvre, a name whose origins are mysterious. Some say it comes from lupara, meaning wolf den, because the area was once inhabited by wolves. Others say it comes from l'œuvre, meaning the work, referring to the massive construction project. The fortress that rose from the muddy banks was dark and imposing. It had a central keep, a massive circular tower called the Grosse Tour that stood 100 feet tall and 50 feet in diameter. The walls were 10 feet thick. Around this tower was a moat filled with water from the Seine. The fortress had no windows facing outward, only narrow arrow slits for archers. This was not a place of beauty. This was a place of war. Inside the Grosse Tour, Philip stored his most valuable possessions, the royal treasury, the royal archives, and weapons. The tower also served another purpose, a prison. Its deep underground dungeons held political prisoners, enemies of the crown, and anyone who threatened the king's power. For over 150 years, the Louvre remained what it was built to be, a fortress, a treasury, and a prison. Kings came and went, but the dark tower on the Seine stayed the same, standing guard over Paris like a silent sentinel. But then, in the 14th century, everything changed. A new kind of king came to power, one who cared more about beauty than battles. His name was Charles V, and he would transform the Louvre from a fortress into something extraordinary. The birth of a palace. Charles V became king in 1364, inheriting a kingdom devastated by war and plague. The 100 Years' War with England had turned France into a battlefield. The Black Death had killed 1/3 of Europe's population. But Charles was different from other medieval kings. He was a scholar, a collector, and a lover of beauty. He didn't want to live in a dark fortress. He wanted to live in a palace. So Charles ordered the transformation of the Louvre. He tore down sections of the fortress walls and replaced them with large windows that let in light. He built grand halls with high ceilings and decorated them with tapestries, paintings, and sculptures. He created gardens where the old training grounds had been. And most importantly, he built a library, the first royal library in France. This library was revolutionary. Charles collected over 1,000 books at a time when owning even 10 books made you wealthy. He gathered manuscripts on philosophy, science, history, and astronomy. He hired scribes to copy texts and illuminators to decorate them with gold leaf and intricate paintings. The library was housed in one of the towers of the Louvre, and Charles would spend hours there, reading by candlelight. But Charles V died in 1380, and France descended into chaos again. Civil wars, invasions, and political intrigue consumed the kingdom. The Louvre was neglected. Some kings used it occasionally, but many preferred to live in other palaces. The beautiful library Charles had built was dispersed, its books scattered or sold. The Louvre began to decay.
For nearly 200 years, the Louvre was forgotten, a relic of an earlier age, slowly crumbling on the banks of the Seine. But then came François I, the Renaissance king who would change everything. François I, the Collector King. In 1515, a young, charismatic king named François I took the throne of France. He was 20 years old, tall and athletic, with a passion for art, music, and literature. François had grown up hearing stories of the Italian Renaissance, of Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael, of cities like Florence and Rome where art and learning flourished. He was determined to bring the Renaissance to France. François looked at the old medieval Louvre and saw an opportunity. He decided to demolish most of the old fortress and build a modern Renaissance palace in its place. In 1528, he ordered the destruction of the Grosse Tour, the massive keep that had stood for over 300 years. It was torn down stone by stone. In its place, François began building a new palace with elegant facades, large windows, and decorated columns in the classical style. But François did something even more important than building. He started collecting. François invited the greatest artists of his time to come to France, and in 1516 he achieved his greatest coup. He convinced Leonardo da Vinci to leave Italy and move to France. Leonardo was 64 years old, tired and sick, but François offered him something irresistible: unlimited funds, complete freedom to work on whatever he wanted, and a comfortable chateau in the Loire Valley. Leonardo accepted. He packed his belongings, including 3 paintings he had been working on for years: the Mona Lisa, the Virgin and Child with St. Anne, and St. John the Baptist. He traveled over the Alps on a mule, carrying these masterpieces with him. When he arrived in France, François treated him like royalty. Leonardo spent the last 3 years of his life in France, and when he died in 1519, François was reportedly at his bedside. After Leonardo's death, François purchased the paintings Leonardo had brought with him, including the Mona Lisa. This is how the most famous painting in the world ended up in France. It was not stolen, it was not looted. François bought it legally from Leonardo's estate. But François didn't stop there. He sent agents across Europe to buy paintings, sculptures, and antiquities. He purchased works by Raphael, Titian, and Andrea del Sarto.
He bought ancient Roman sculptures and Greek manuscripts. By the time Francois died in 1547, he had assembled one of the greatest art collections in Europe, over 1,500 works stored in the Louvre and other royal palaces. Francois had planted a seed. Future French kings would nurture it, and it would grow into something magnificent. The grand design. For the next 100 years, French kings continued to expand the Louvre and the royal art collection. Henry II, Catherine of Medici, Charles IX, each added their own sections to the palace. But it was Henri IV in the early 1600s who conceived the grand design, an audacious plan to connect the Louvre to the Tuileries, which stood about 500 meters to the west. Henri IV wanted to create the largest palace complex in the world. He began building the Grande Galerie, a wing that stretched along the Seine River connecting the two palaces. This gallery was over 400 meters long, one of the longest rooms in Europe. Henri IV filled it with paintings and sculptures from the royal collection. Artists were given apartments in the Louvre and used spaces in the Grande Galerie as studios. But Henri IV was assassinated in 1610, stabbed to death by a religious fanatic. His vision was left unfinished. His son, Louis XIII, and his grandson, Louis XVI, would continue the work. Louis XIV, the Sun King, completed the Cour Carrée, the magnificent central courtyard of the Louvre, surrounded by elegant facades designed by the greatest architects in France. But then Louis XIV made a decision that would change the Louvre's fate. In 1782, he moved the royal court out of Paris to a new palace he was building at Versailles. The Louvre, which had been the center of French power for centuries, was abandoned by the king. The royal family took many of their finest artworks to Versailles, leaving the Louvre half empty. The palace began to decay again. Sections were taken over by artists, craftsmen, and even squatters. The courtyards became workshops. Laundry hung from the windows. The once grand halls were divided into apartments. The Louvre, which had been destined to be the greatest palace in Europe, had become a slum. But life is unpredictable. Sometimes the greatest transformations come from the most violent upheavals. And in 1789, a revolution was coming that would change not just the Louvre, but the entire world. The Palace of the People. July 14, 1789. A mob of Parisian citizens stormed the Bastille, a fortress prison that symbolized royal tyranny. The French Revolution had begun. Within months, King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette were arrested. The monarchy was abolished. France became a republic, and the revolutionaries had to decide what to do with all the art and treasures that belonged to the king. Some wanted to destroy it all, to burn the paintings, smash the sculptures, erase every trace of the old regime. But others had a different vision. They argued that art and culture belonged not to kings, but to the people. One revolutionary declared, "The Louvre must become a museum where the people can see the masterpieces that were stolen from them by tyrants." On August 10, 1793, the Louvre opened as the Musée Central des Arts, the Central Museum of Arts. For the first time in history, ordinary people could walk through the halls where kings had lived and see the paintings and sculptures that had been hidden away in royal palaces for centuries. Farmers, shopkeepers, laborers, anyone could enter for free. The revolutionaries brought artworks from Versailles, from churches, from the homes of executed aristocrats. The collection grew rapidly. Rooms that had once been royal apartments were cleared out and turned into galleries. The Grande Galerie, which had been cluttered with artists' studios, was transformed into a breathtaking gallery displaying hundreds of paintings. But the most dramatic moment came in January 1793. King Louis XVI was executed by guillotine in the Place de Revolution. Marie Antoinette followed in October. The monarchy was dead, and the Louvre, the palace that had been built to protect kings, became the symbol of their downfall. The revolutionaries renamed it the Museum of the Republic. They hung a sign above the entrance that read, "This museum is for the instruction and pleasure of all citizens." It was a radical idea, that culture should be democratic, that beauty should not be locked away for the privileged few. But the French Revolution was about to give way to something even more dramatic. A young Corsican general was rising through the ranks of the French army. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte, and he was about to turn the Louvre into the greatest museum the world had ever seen, through conquest, plunder, and theft on a scale never seen before. Napoleon's Treasure House. Napoleon Bonaparte crowned himself Emperor of France in 1804 in a lavish ceremony at Notre Dame Cathedral. He was 35 years old, a military genius who had conquered most of Europe, and he had a vision for the Louvre. He would fill it with the greatest masterpieces from every nation he conquered. He would create a universal museum, a temple to human civilization, with Paris at its center. But there was a problem. Most of those masterpieces belonged to other countries, so Napoleon simply took them. Wherever Napoleon's armies marched, they looted. In Italy, they stripped churches, palaces, and museums of their greatest treasures. The Vatican was ransacked. The bronze horses of St. Mark's Basilica in Venice, which had been stolen during the Fourth Crusade, were stolen again and shipped to Paris to decorate the Arc de Triomphe. Raphael's Transfiguration, Titian's masterpieces, works by Caravaggio, Tintoretto, Veronese, all were crated up and sent to the Louvre. From Germany, Napoleon's armies took the Pergamon altar reliefs and countless medieval treasures. From Spain, they looted paintings by Velázquez and Goya. From Egypt, Napoleon brought back ancient artifacts, including the Rosetta Stone, though the British seized it before it could reach France. Napoleon renamed the Louvre the Musée Napoléon. He appointed the brilliant art historian Dominique Vivant Denon as director. Denon traveled with Napoleon's armies, personally selecting which artworks to confiscate. He chose only the best, the most famous, the most beautiful, the most historically significant. By 1810, the Louvre had become the greatest collection of art in history. Over 5,000 paintings, 20,000 drawings, and countless sculptures and antiquities. The Grand Gallery was transformed into a breathtaking display of European masterpieces. Visitors from across Europe came to Paris to see wonders that had been scattered across a continent now united in one building. Napoleon would walk through the galleries with his wife Josephine, admiring the spoils of his conquests. He saw the Louvre as proof of his greatness, that he had not just conquered nations, but had brought together the pinnacle of human achievement under one roof. He believed he was building a legacy that would last forever. But Napoleon's empire, like all empires, was fragile, and in 1815, everything collapsed. The Great Return. June 18, 1815. The Battle of Waterloo. Napoleon's final defeat. The French army was crushed by the British and Prussians. Napoleon was captured and exiled to the remote island of St. Helena, where he would die 6 years later. His empire was over, and now the victorious nations wanted their art back. The British, Austrians, Prussians, and Russians occupied Paris. They marched into the Louvre with lists of artworks that had been stolen from their countries. The Duke of Wellington personally oversaw the return of Italian masterpieces. Prussian officers supervised the removal of German treasures. The Austrians reclaimed their paintings. For months, wagons rolled out of the Louvre loaded with crated artworks heading back to Rome, Vienna, Berlin, Madrid, and Amsterdam. It was a reverse plunder. Nearly 5,000 artworks were removed and returned to their countries of origin. The French protested. Denon begged the occupying forces to leave at least some of the masterpieces. Some French citizens even tried to hide artworks to prevent their removal. But the Allies were firm. Napoleon had stolen these treasures through conquest. Now they would be returned. The Raphael paintings went back to the Vatican. The bronze horses returned to Venice. The great altarpieces went back to German churches. However, not everything was returned. Some artworks had been purchased legally by French collectors before Napoleon came to power, including Leonardo's Mona Lisa, which had been bought by François I in 1519. Other works were given to France as diplomatic gifts or had been acquired through legitimate purchases, and some artworks were simply never claimed, either because their original owners couldn't be identified or because the countries they came from no longer existed. When the returns were complete, the Louvre had lost 2/3 of its collection. The once mighty Musée Napoléon was gutted. The galleries that had been packed with masterpieces now had bare walls. It was a humiliation for France, a reminder that Napoleon's glory had been built on theft. But the idea of a universal public museum survived, and French curators, collectors, and the government were determined to rebuild the collection, this time through legitimate means. The rise of the modern museum. Throughout the 19th century, the Louvre transformed itself. No longer relying on conquest, France began purchasing artworks, accepting donations, and funding archaeological expeditions. The focus shifted from amassing trophies of war to building a comprehensive collection that represented human civilization across time and geography. In 1821, France purchased the Venus of Milos from a Greek farmer on the island of Milos. This ancient Greek sculpture, carved around 100 BC, became one of the Louvre's most famous treasures, a symbol of classical beauty with her missing arms creating an eternal mystery. In 1863, France acquired the Winged Victory of Samothrace, discovered by a French archaeologist on a Greek island. This magnificent Hellenistic sculpture of the goddess Nike, carved around 200 BC, was placed at the top of the Daru staircase, where it still stands today, one of the most dramatic moments in any museum in the world. The Louvre's departments expanded. The Egyptian Antiquities Department was established in 1826, filled with treasures from French expeditions to Egypt. The Near Eastern Antiquities Department was established in 1881, housing artifacts from Mesopotamia, Persia, and the Levant, including the famous Code of Hammurabi, one of the oldest written legal codes in history, carved on a stone stele nearly 4,000 years ago. The Islamic Art Department was created to house masterpieces from the Islamic world, ceramics, metalwork, carpets, and manuscripts spanning 1,300 years of Islamic civilization. The Decorative Arts Department displayed furniture, tapestries, and precious objects from French royal collections. By the late 19th century, the Louvre had become what Napoleon had dreamed, a universal museum, but built on scholarship and acquisition rather than theft. It was a place where you could trace the entire history of human art and culture, from ancient Mesopotamia to 19th century France, all under one roof.
But the 20th century would bring new challenges. 2 world wars would threaten everything the Louvre had built, and the most famous painting in the collection would face the greatest threat of all: the theft of the Mona Lisa. August 21, 1911, a Monday morning. The Louvre was closed for maintenance. A small Italian man named Vincenzo Perugia, who worked as a handyman at the museum, walked through the empty galleries. He knew the routines, he knew the guards, and he knew exactly where the Mona Lisa hung. Perugia walked into the Salon Carré, lifted the painting off the wall, removed it from its frame, and hid it under his coat. Then he simply walked out of the museum. No one stopped him. No one even noticed. It wasn't until the next day that a visitor asked where the Mona Lisa was. The guards assumed it had been removed for photography, which happened often, but when they checked with the photography department, panic set. The painting was gone. The most famous artwork in the Louvre had been stolen. The news exploded across the world. Newspapers ran headlines screaming about the theft. The French government launched a massive investigation. The museum was closed for a week. Every employee was questioned.
Even the famous poet Guillaume Apollinaire and his friend Pablo Picasso were brought in for questioning because they had once joked about stealing from the Louvre. But Vincenzo Perugia had vanished with the Mona Lisa. He kept the painting hidden in his apartment in Paris for 2 years. He believed he was a patriot, that Leonardo's painting should be in Italy, not France. He didn't know that Leonardo himself had brought the painting to France and sold it to the French king. Perugia thought he was righting a historical wrong. In December 1913, Perugia traveled to Florence, Italy, carrying the Mona Lisa in a wooden trunk. He contacted an art dealer, claiming he wanted to return the painting to Italy. The dealer immediately recognized the painting and contacted the police. Perugia was arrested. Ironically, Italy treated Perugia as a hero. Before returning the painting to France, the Italian government displayed it in Florence and Rome, where millions of Italians lined up to see it. It was a victory tour. But eventually, the Mona Lisa was returned to the Louvre in January 1914, welcomed back like a lost child. The theft had an unexpected consequence. It made the Mona Lisa even more famous. Before 1911, it was just one of many Renaissance masterpieces in the Louvre. After the theft, it became a global icon, the most recognizable painting in the world. People who had never heard of Leonardo da Vinci knew about the Mona Lisa. But just months after the painting's return, a far greater threat emerged. In August 1914, World War I began, and soon the entire Louvre collection would be in danger. The evacuation. When World War I broke out, German armies advanced rapidly through Belgium toward Paris. The French government feared the city would be captured. Museum curators faced a terrifying decision. What do you do with 380,000 irreplaceable artworks when enemy armies are approaching? The answer was evacuation. In a massive operation, the most valuable paintings and sculptures were removed from the Louvre and shipped to chateaux in the French countryside, far from the fighting. The Mona Lisa was sent to Bordeaux. The Venus of Milo was hidden in a bunker. The winged Victory was too large and heavy to move, so it was left in place, protected by sandbags. Fortunately, Paris did not fall in World War I. The German advance was stopped at the Battle of the Marne. The artworks eventually returned. But the experience taught museum directors a crucial lesson. They needed an evacuation plan. That lesson proved vital when World War II began in 1939. As Nazi Germany invaded Poland, the Louvre began evacuating again, but this time on even larger scale. Over 4,000 artworks were packed and shipped to castles and monasteries across France. The Mona Lisa alone was moved 6 times during the war to keep it safe from German bombers and advancing armies. When German forces occupied Paris in June 1940, the Louvre was nearly empty. The Nazis demanded access, and French museum staff took them on tours of empty galleries, explaining that the great masterpieces had been sent to safe locations. Hitler's art agents searched desperately for the hidden treasures, but never found the main repositories. But the Nazis did loot private collections belonging to Jewish families. Over 100,000 artworks were stolen across Europe. After the war, many of these artworks ended up in museums. The Louvre played a central role in identifying stolen art and returning it to rightful owners, a process that continues even today. The Louvre survived both world wars intact, but by the 1980s, the building itself was in crisis. It had been neglected for decades. Parts of the structure were crumbling. The museum was overcrowded with poor lighting and inadequate security. Something had to be done. And then French President François Mitterrand announced a project that would shock the world and change the Louvre forever. The Pyramid Revolution. In 1981, François Mitterrand became president of France. He was a socialist with grand visions, and he wanted to leave his mark on Paris through monumental building projects. His most ambitious project was called the Grand Louvre, a complete renovation and expansion of the museum that would double its exhibition space and turn it into the greatest cultural institution in the world. But Mitterrand made a controversial decision. He hired I.M. Pei, a Chinese-American architect, to design the renovation, and Pei proposed something radical: a giant glass pyramid in the center of the Louvre's historic courtyard, the Cour Napoléon, that would serve as the museum's new main entrance. When the design was announced in 1984, Paris erupted in fury. Critics called it an abomination, a disgrace, a violation of French heritage. How dare they put a modern glass pyramid in front of a Renaissance palace? Newspapers published scathing editorials, architects held protests, even French President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, Mitterrand's predecessor, called it a gigantic, ruinous gadget. The controversy was brutal. People said the pyramid would look like a spaceship, that it would destroy the harmony of the Louvre's architecture, that it was an ego project by a president who cared more about looking modern than respecting history. But Mitterrand and Pei pushed forward. Construction began in 1985. The pyramid would be 71 feet tall, made of glass panels held together by a delicate steel frame. Beneath it would be a vast underground lobby connecting the Louvre's 3 wings, with shops, restaurants, and ticket counters. The old cramped entrances would be abandoned. Instead, visitors would descend through the pyramid into a light-filled underground space that opened onto the galleries. The technical challenges were enormous. The glass had to be perfectly clear. Any tint or distortion would ruin the effect. Pei insisted on using a special laminated glass that was nearly invisible. The engineering of the underground spaces required excavating beneath centuries-old foundations without causing the palace to collapse. When the pyramid was completed in 1989, the protests reached a crescendo. Opening day was met with demonstrations. Critics predicted it would be a disaster, that visitors would hate it, that history would judge Mitterrand as the man who ruined the Louvre. But then something unexpected happened. People loved it. The pyramid was beautiful, elegant, light, modern, yet respectful of its historic surroundings. During the day, it was transparent, allowing views of the palace through its glass. At night, it glowed from within like a lantern. The underground spaces were spacious and welcoming, solving decades of overcrowding problems. The pyramid became an instant icon, as recognizable as the Eiffel Tower. Within a few years, the same critics who had condemned the pyramid were praising it as a masterpiece. It appeared in movies, on postcards, in countless photographs. It became the symbol of the Louvre itself. Today, it's impossible to imagine the Louvre without the pyramid. It proved that old and new, history and modernity, could coexist beautifully. The pyramid transformed the Louvre in another way, too. It made the museum accessible. Before 1989, the Louvre was intimidating. You had to know which entrance to use, how to navigate the confusing layout. The pyramid created a clear, welcoming entrance that invited everyone in. Visitor numbers doubled, then tripled. By 2018, over 10 million people visited the Louvre each year, making it the most visited museum on Earth. The treasures within. Today, when you enter through the pyramid and descend into the underground lobby, you face a choice. Which wing do you explore first? Each direction leads to a different journey through human history and creativity. If you turn toward the Sully wing, you enter the world of ancient civilizations. Here are the Egyptian galleries, filled with mummies, hieroglyphs, and massive statues of pharaohs. The colossal pink granite sphinx of Tanis stares at you with enigmatic eyes. The seated scribe, a painted limestone statue over 4,500 years old, sits cross-legged with his papyrus scroll, his eyes inlaid with crystal that makes him seem startlingly alive. In the Near Eastern galleries, you can stand before the Code of Hammurabi, carved with 282 laws in cuneiform script, one of humanity's first attempts to create a just society through written law. Nearby are the glazed brick reliefs from the Palace of Darius in Persia, showing archers in brilliant colors that have survived 2,500 years. If you turn toward the Danan wing, you enter the realm of European painting and sculpture, decorative arts, and the magnificent apartments of Napoleon III. Here you can see Jacques-Louis David's massive painting, The Coronation of Napoleon, showing the moment Napoleon crowned himself emperor. The painting is so large, over 20 feet wide, that you feel like you're standing in Notre Dame Cathedral watching the ceremony unfold. In the sculpture courts, covered by stunning glass roofs that flood the space with natural light, stand masterpieces of French sculpture. The Marly horses, two massive sculptures of rearing horses and their handlers, originally created for King Louis XIV's palace at Marly, now frozen in dynamic motion beneath the glass ceiling. You could spend months in the Louvre and still not see everything. The Islamic art galleries, opened in 2012 and housed under a stunning golden veil of glass, display 3,000 works spanning 1,300 years. The Greek and Roman sculpture galleries hold masterpieces like the Venus of Milo, standing in serene beauty despite her missing arms, or perhaps because of them. The missing arms force you to imagine, to complete the sculpture in your mind, making you an active participant in the art. This is the magic of the Louvre. It is not just a collection of objects, but a journey through the entire arc of human creativity and civilization.